Hello and welcome to the Law Lab. Here we dissect and unpack everything legal. My name is Jacqueline Opoku, and today we will continue with our discussion on capacity to contract. In our previous video, we discussed capacity to contract whilst focusing on the contractual capacity of a minor. We stated that there are three categories of persons who cannot enter into a contract, and these persons were minors, intoxicated persons, and persons of unsound mind. We focused mainly on minors in our previous video. Today, we'll be focusing on the other two categories of persons, and these persons are intoxicated persons and persons of unsound mind. We will start with persons of unsound mind or mentally incompetent persons. When we say someone is mentally incompetent, that means the person is unable to appreciate the nature of his actions. Hence, he does not even know the consequences of the actions he engaged in. In relating it to contract law, when a person enters into a contract and he's unable to appreciate the nature and the consequences of his action in the contract he has entered into, the person will be deemed to be a mentally incompetent person and hence lacks the contractual capacity. When we look at a mentally incompetent person, we have to look at whether or not the contract they enter into is binding on them, or it is void, or it is voidable at the instance of the mentally incompetent person. In the case of Imperial Loan versus Stone, the court stated that for one to be able to look at whether or not the person who has entered into a contract lacks the mental capacity to understand the contract he or she has entered into, we have to look at whether when the person entered into the contract at that very moment, he or she appreciated the nature and the consequences of the action, and whether he could foretell if the contract he's entering into is the right one for him. In the case of Imperial Loan versus Stone, once again, the court gave two tests in order to know whether or not a person is mentally incompetent. In that case, the court stated that one, if the person is unable to appreciate the nature and consequences of the contracts he has entered into, then the person will be deemed to be mentally incompetent, or at the time he was entering into the contract, the other party very much knew or ought to have known that the party is entering into the contract with is a mentally incompetent person. The burden of proof lies on the mentally incompetent person who claims that he did not understand and appreciate the nature of the contract he has entered into. When we say burden of proof, it simply means that the person has to be able to show or lead evidence that the contract he entered into, he did not appreciate the nature of the contract. If a person is mentally incompetent and he enters into a contract, the contract is voidable and not void. Voidable means that the contract is binding until the contract is set aside. Setting aside a contract means that the contract will continue to be in subsistence until you decide that I do not want to be bound by this contract anymore, because I have been able to lead evidence, or I have been able to prove that at the time I entered into the contract, I was mentally incompetent, and the other party also knew or ought to have known that I was mentally incompetent. There are situations where a mentally incompetent person enters into a contract and that contract will be binding on him or her. This is a contract for necessaries. Contract for necessaries, as we already stated in our previous video, is a contract in which a person enters into and then they are supposed to suit the condition of life he or she is in at the very moment he ordered for the goods and at the time of delivery. Hence, if a mentally incompetent person enters into a contract for necessaries, he is expected to pay a reasonable price. For example, if a mentally incompetent person goes to a food seller to buy food, he or she is expected to pay a reasonable price. This is because the food seller expected a reasonable price or expected money in exchange for the goods he or she delivered to the mentally incompetent person. In the case of Selby versus Jackson, the court stated that when a person is mentally incompetent, in the case of Inri Rhodes, the case will be put on the screen for you to know and for easy identification. So in the case of Inri Rhodes, the court held that when a mentally incompetent person enters into a contract for necessaries, he is expected to pay a reasonable price for the goods that have been delivered to him. And even if the food seller, or even if the other party was unaware or knew that he was mentally incompetent, the mentally incompetent person is still expected to pay reasonable price for the contract for necessaries. Again, there are situations where, although the person may be of an unsound mind, he or she will regain consciousness or will be able to appreciate the nature of the contract he has entered into at the very moment he agreed to be bound by the contract. In those situations, they are called lucid moments. In those situations, the courts have held in the case of Selby versus Jackson that the mentally incompetent person or the person of unsound mind is bound by the contract. That means he's expected to perform his part of the contract. We have so far looked at the mental capacity or the contractual capacity of a mentally incompetent person, and we have noted that he or she is not bound by the contract, but rather the contract is voidable at the instance of the mentally incompetent person. Hence, the contract will continue to be in subsistence until he repudiates or sets the contract aside. Or there are situations where he would enter into contract for necessaries. He is expected to pay a reasonable price for it. Or there are situations where he enters into a contract where he has regained consciousness, or he has entered into a contract in his lucid moment. The contract will be deemed to be binding on him. Then we will proceed to the next category of person who cannot enter into a contract, or even if he or she enters into a contract, the contract is voidable. This person is known as the intoxicated person or a drunken person. When we say a person is intoxicated or drunken, that means that the person is either under the influence of drugs, influence of alcohol, or anything that renders the person not to be able to appreciate the nature of the actions he is committing. So if we relate it into the capacity to contract, if an intoxicated person enters into a contract, that means that at the very moment he entered into the contract, he was unable to appreciate the nature and the aftermath of the contract because he or she was under the influence of drugs or alcohol or anything that rendered him to not be able to appreciate the nature of the contract he has entered into. In that moment, the contract will be said to be voidable at the instance of the intoxicated person. Once again, voidable means that the contract will continue to be in subsistence until the intoxicated person sets the contract aside. The court in the case of Matthews versus Baxter held that if an intoxicated person entered into a contract and he claims to be intoxicated, he has the burden of proof to show that at the time he entered into the contract, he could not appreciate the nature of the contract, and also the other party was very much aware that he was intoxicated, or even the other party was the one who intoxicated him in order to enter into the contract. The court has stated in the case of Matthew versus Baxter that the contract will be voidable. But then there are situations where the drunken or the intoxicated person would regain his consciousness or will become sober. When he regains his consciousness or he becomes sober, that means he's no more under the influence of drugs or alcohol or anything that will render him not to appreciate the nature of the contract he has entered into. Then he can decide that I have read the contract and I have understood and appreciated it. Therefore, I intend to ratify the contract. Ratification simply means that I am adopting the contract that I entered into, although at the time I entered into the contract, I could not appreciate the nature of the contract. So when he or she decides to ratify or adopt the contract, then the contract will be binding. Hence, the other party can sue to enforce the contract against the intoxicated person. Mind you, he should have regained his consciousness or he should have been sober in order to adopt the contract. Also, as it runs through minors or persons of unsound mind and intoxicated. If a person who is intoxicated enters into a contract for necessaries, the contract will be binding on the intoxicated person and he will be expected to pay reasonable price for the contract for necessaries. Once again, example of contract for necessaries are food, shelter, clothing, and you must look at the situation or the condition of life at the time the person ordered for these contracts of necessaries, and if they suit his actual requirements, and at the time they were delivered in the shape that he ought to have accepted the goods. So far, we have had an interesting discussion on contract capacity of persons, or the capacity to enter into a contract. We looked at the definition of what a capacity is, and we related it to contracts. We looked at the three categories of persons who cannot enter into a contract, or even if they do enter into a contract, the contract would either be void or voidable at the instance of those persons. We looked at them to be minors, and we stated the general rule of minors entry into a contract. We looked at the exceptions, and then in today's discussion, we have considered the other two categories of persons, namely intoxicated persons or drunken persons, and persons of unsound mind or mentally incompetent persons. Thank you for tuning in to the Law Lab. Here, we dissect and unpack everything legal. We ask you to continue to like, comment, and share, and subscribe to our videos. Thank you for joining us on having a fruitful discussion on capacity to contract. Once again, my name is Jacqueline. Thank you.